Welcome to StoriesX. An eerie silence gripped the courtroom as 8-year-old Emily spoke 6 life-altering words. Daddy didn't do it, but I know who did. What she revealed next unraveled a web of deception, uncovering shocking truths that would change her family forever. If you're ready to dive into this incredible journey of resilience and justice, hit that like button to support the channel and help us continue sharing these unforgettable stories. Emily, can you please repeat what you just said? The lawyer's voice trembled, caught between disbelief and awe. The courtroom, which had been abuzz moments before, now fell into an eerie silence. All eyes turned to the little girl seated on the witness stand. Her legs barely reached the edge of the chair. She held a stuffed bunny tightly in her arms, its worn fur suggesting it had been her constant companion through countless storms. I said. Emily's voice was small but steady. Daddy didn't do it, but I know who did. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like waves crashing against rocks. The judge leaned forward, his gavel hovering uncertainly above the bench. Emily's mother covered her mouth with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. The prosecutor, visibly startled, adjusted his glasses and furiously flipped through his notes. Even Emily's father, sitting at the defense table with dark circles under his eyes, looked up in shock, hope flickering in his gaze for the first time in months. The lawyer pressed gently. Emily, can you tell us who it was? The little girl looked down at her bunny, stroking its ear as if seeking reassurance. I can, she said softly, lifting her head to meet the room's collective gaze. But before she could finish, the prosecutor jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The judge slammed his gavel. Order in the court, his voice rang out. But the tension in the room was palpable, every breath held hostage by what Emily might say next. It hadn't always been like this. A few months earlier, the Thompson family was as ordinary as any on their quiet suburban street. Emily, a precocious 8-year-old with a vivid imagination, loved nothing more than playing in the park with her dad, Matt. He was her hero, funny, kind, and always willing to play along with her made-up adventures. Her mom, Sarah, worked long hours as a nurse, but when she was home, their small house was filled with laughter and the smell of fresh cookies. One warm summer evening, as fireflies danced outside the living room window, everything changed. Matt had kissed Emily goodnight and tucked her into bed like he always did. But before the sun rose, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the neighborhood. Police cars lined the driveway, and Matt was led out of the house in handcuffs. Daddy! Emily screamed, running down the stairs in her pajamas. What's happening? Sarah pulled her back, her own face pale and drawn. Go back to your room, sweetheart, she whispered, her voice breaking. It's going to be okay, but it wasn't okay. Matt was accused of a crime so serious it shook their family to its core. A neighbor, Mr. Richards, had been attacked in his home and left for dead. Witnesses claimed they saw Matt fleeing the scene that night. The evidence seemed damning. Matt's fingerprints were on the back door handle, and his wallet was found near the victim. Matt insisted he was innocent, but no one seemed to believe him. Friends and neighbors started avoiding the Thompsons, whispers following Sarah and Emily wherever they went. At school, Emily's classmates treated her like a leper, their parents warning them to stay away from the daughter of a criminal. Sarah struggled to keep things together. She worked double shifts to pay the mounting legal bills, but it was clear she was drowning. Emily tried to be brave, hiding her tears and pretending she didn't hear her mom crying at night. But inside, she missed her dad terribly and felt the sting of loneliness like a bruise that wouldn't heal. One day, while Emily was playing in the backyard, she overheard 2 police officers talking outside the neighbor's house. They didn't notice her behind the fence, crouched in the bushes like a spy. Something about this case doesn't sit right with me, one officer said. The other shrugged. Maybe, but the DA's got enough to convict him. The fingerprints alone. Still, the first officer interrupted, lowering his voice. I keep thinking about those other break-ins. Same neighborhood, same MO but no arrests. What if... Emily didn't hear the rest. Her mind raced as she ran inside to tell her mom, but Sarah was too tired and overwhelmed to listen. Not now, honey, she said, rubbing her temples. I can't deal with this right now. Emily felt helpless. But that night, as she hugged her bunny, under the covers an idea began to form. She didn't know much about laws or evidence, but she knew her dad was innocent. If no one else could prove it, she would have to try. The next few weeks were a blur of small, secret acts of bravery. Emily listened closely to adult conversations, jotting down notes in her diary. She asked questions that seemed innocent but were anything but. She even sneaked into her dad's lawyer's office one afternoon, pretending to look for the bathroom, and caught a glimpse of the case files on his desk. One detail stuck out to her. Mr. Richards, the victim, had recently argued with another neighbor about money. Emily remembered seeing the man, a grumpy old widower named Mr. Baldwin, sneaking around the neighborhood late at night. Her heart pounded as she wondered if he could be involved. But how could she prove it? She was just a little girl. No one would listen to her. The answer came unexpectedly one evening when Sarah was late getting home. Emily was watching TV, flipping through channels, when she landed on a courtroom drama. She watched wide-eyed as a young witness took the stand and told the truth, even when it was scary. The crowd in the show gasped and the lawyer said, "Sometimes even the smallest voices can speak the loudest." Emily clutched her bunny tightly. Just maybe she could do that too. When the trial began, Emily begged her mom to let her attend. Sarah hesitated, not wanting Emily to see her dad in such a heartbreaking situation. But Emily was insistent. "Please, Mom," she said. "I have to be there." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. Emily sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, her bunny tucked under her arm, watching and waiting. The trial dragged on, the prosecutor painting Matt as a desperate man with a motive to harm Mr. Richards. Witness after witness testified against him, and Emily's hope began to waver. But then on the third day, something incredible happened. During a break in the proceedings, Emily overheard the prosecutor talking to someone on the phone. He mentioned a key piece of evidence being missing, a security camera that had been damaged during the break-in. Emily's heart raced. She remembered seeing Mr. Baldwin fiddling with his tools near that very camera a few days before the crime. She had even told her mom about it, but Sarah had dismissed it as unimportant. Emily knew this was her moment. She tugged on her dad's lawyer's sleeve and whispered urgently, "I need to talk. I know something." The lawyer hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who looked bewildered but nodded. And that's how Emily, trembling but determined, found herself on the witness stand, her bunny clutched in her arms as she revealed what she knew. The courtroom erupted when Emily finished speaking, and the judge had to call for order. But even as the chaos unfolded, Emily sat quietly, staring at Mr. Baldwin in the audience. For the first time, the grumpy old man looked nervous, very nervous. And just as the judge regained control, Emily said something that made everyone freeze. "I can tell you where to look," she said. "If you don't believe me, I know where you'll find proof." The room was electric, the tension unbearable. But what Emily said next would have to wait because the chapter had just begun. The courtroom buzzed with frantic whispers, everyone trying to piece together the meaning of Emily's words. The judge leaned forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice measured, "you've made some very serious claims. Can you explain what you mean?" Emily hesitated, her small fingers fiddling nervously with her bunny's ear. Her dad's lawyer, Mr. Grayson, gave her an encouraging nod, his face pale but hopeful. Sarah sat in the gallery, frozen in a mix of fear and awe. Emily took a deep breath and spoke again, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. I saw Mr. Baldwin near Mr. Richards's house. He was fixing the camera right before it broke. I think he did it. A stunned silence followed her statement. All eyes turned to Mr. Baldwin, seated near the back of the courtroom. The older man shifted uncomfortably, his face reddening under the scrutiny. "Objection!" the prosecutor barked, standing abruptly. "Your Honor, this testimony is speculative at best. She's a child and her claims lack credibility." Judge Whitaker raised a hand, silencing the room. "Sit down, Mr. Collins," he said firmly. "I'll decide what's credible in this courtroom." He turned back to Emily, his expression softening. "Emily, do you have any more information? Anything that could help us understand what you saw?" Emily nodded slowly. "Yes, I wrote it all down in my diary, and I heard Mr. Baldwin say something to Mr. Richards before the camera broke. He said, 'You'll regret messing with me.'" Gasps erupted again, and Mr. Baldwin's face turned an alarming shade of crimson. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. "Order!" the judge thundered, banging his gavel. "Mr. Baldwin, you will remain silent unless called to the stand." Emily looked down, clutching her bunny tighter. She had said what she needed to say, but the tension in the room was suffocating. What if they didn't believe her? What if it wasn't enough to save her dad? "Emily," Mr. Grayson said gently, approaching the witness stand. "You mentioned your diary. Do you have it with you?" Emily nodded and reached into her small backpack, pulling out a well-worn pink notebook. She handed it to the lawyer, who flipped through it carefully, his eyes widening as he read her notes. Then he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request a recess to review this evidence and follow up on Emily's claims." The prosecutor jumped to his feet again. "This is absurd. We're taking the word of an 8-year-old and derailing the trial." The judge glared at him. "Mr. Collins, sit down. The court will recess for 2 hours while this new information is reviewed." The gavel slammed, and the courtroom erupted into chaos, as people whispered, speculated, and craned their necks to get a better look at Mr. Baldwin, who was now sweating profusely. In the hallway outside, Emily sat on a bench with her mom while Mr. Grayson and the legal team pored over her diary. Sarah hugged Emily tightly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Emily, why didn't you tell me any of this before?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I tried, but you were always so tired," Emily said softly, "and I didn't know if it was important. But when I saw Daddy in court, I knew I had to do something." Sarah kissed the top of Emily's head, guilt and pride warring in her heart. "You're so brave, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Nearby, Mr. Baldwin was speaking angrily with his lawyer. Emily couldn't hear everything, but his raised voice and frantic gestures made her stomach churn. She tugged on her mom's sleeve. "Mom, do you think he's scared?" Emily asked. Sarah glanced at the man, her jaw tightening. "He should be." The 2 hours crawled by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, Mr. Grayson approached them with a serious look on his face. "Emily, your notes were very helpful," he said. "The investigators found something interesting. That security camera, it wasn't just broken. It was tampered with, and they found fingerprints on it." Sarah's eyes widened. "Whose fingerprints?" Mr. Grayson hesitated. "They haven't confirmed yet, but they think they belong to Mr. Baldwin." Emily's heart raced. "Does that mean Daddy can come home?" "Not yet, Mr. Grayson said gently. "This is a big step, but we still have to prove that Mr. Baldwin was involved. We're going to request a subpoena for his financial records and check if there's any link to Mr. Richards." Emily's shoulders slumped. She had hoped her testimony would be enough, but it seemed like there was still a long way to go. "Don't lose hope, Emily," Mr. Grayson said. "You've already done something incredible. We just need a little more time." When the trial resumed, the atmosphere was even tenser than before. Mr. Baldwin's lawyer had filed a motion to dismiss Emily's testimony, arguing it was hearsay, but Judge Whitaker overruled the motion, stating that the evidence provided warranted further investigation. The prosecutor tried to regain control of the narrative, focusing on the original evidence against Matt. He called the lead detective to the stand, highlighting the fingerprints and wallet found at the scene. Emily felt her heart sink as the case against her dad seemed to solidify once more. But then, as the detective was cross-examined by Mr. Grayson, a new detail emerged. "Detective Harris," Mr. Grayson said, pacing in front of the jury, "you testified that the defendant's wallet was found near the victim's home, correct?" "Yes," the detective replied. "Did you test the wallet for fingerprints?" The detective frowned. "Yes, but they only matched Mr. Thompson's." "And were there any signs that the wallet had been wiped clean or handled by someone else?" The detective hesitated. "There were some smudges, but we couldn't determine if they were intentional." Mr. Grayson's eyes narrowed. "So it's possible someone planted the wallet there." The prosecutor objected, but the judge allowed the line of questioning. The detective reluctantly admitted, "It's possible." Emily's heart leapt. It wasn't a definitive answer, but it was enough to sow doubt in the jury's minds. And as the day's proceedings came to a close, Mr. Grayson approached the judge with a bold request. "Your Honor, given the new evidence and the potential involvement of Mr. Baldwin, I request that he be called to testify." The courtroom erupted again, and Emily watched as Mr. Baldwin's face turned pale. The judge banged his gavel. "Court is adjourned for the day. Mr. Baldwin, you are hereby ordered to return tomorrow morning to testify." As the courtroom emptied, Emily felt a flicker of hope, but she also knew the battle was far from over, and judging by the way Mr. Baldwin stormed out of the room, she had a feeling things were about to get even more complicated. The next morning, the courtroom was packed to the brim. Word had spread quickly about Emily's testimony, and the judge's order for Mr. Baldwin to take the stand. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions to anyone who walked by. Inside, the tension was almost unbearable. Emily sat between her mom and Mr. Grayson, clutching her bunny tightly. "Do you think he'll tell the truth?" Emily whispered to her mom. Sarah gave her a small, encouraging smile. "We'll find out, sweetheart." When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Mr. Baldwin was already seated in the witness box, looking far less confident than he had the day before. His lawyer sat stiffly at the defense table, flipping through a stack of papers. "Mr. Baldwin," Judge Whitaker began, his tone firm, "you've been called to testify regarding the events surrounding the attack on Mr. Richards. Do you understand?" Mr. Baldwin nodded, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecutor started with basic questions about Baldwin's relationship with Mr. Richards. Baldwin admitted they had been neighbors for years, but claimed they barely interacted. "And yet," Mr. Grayson said when it was his turn to cross-examine, "you were seen arguing with Mr. Richards shortly before the incident. Is that correct?" Baldwin's face reddened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Emily's heart pounded. She could see right through his lie. He looked like a cornered animal, desperate to escape. "Mr. Baldwin," Mr. Grayson continued, his voice calm but relentless, "a witness overheard you telling Mr. Richards, and I quote, 'You'll regret messing with me.' Do you deny saying that?" Baldwin shifted uncomfortably. "I might have said something like that, but it wasn't serious." "Oh." Mr. Grayson raised an eyebrow. "And how do you explain being seen near the security camera that was tampered with just before the incident?" "I wasn't tampering with it," Baldwin snapped, his voice rising. "I was fixing it," the courtroom murmured, and the judge banged his gavel for order. "Fixing it?" Mr. Grayson repeated, feigning curiosity. "Do you often fix security cameras for your neighbors?" Baldwin opened his mouth, then closed it again, his face pale. "I didn't think so," Mr. Grayson said, stepping closer to the witness box. "And do you have an explanation for why your fingerprints were found on that camera?" The courtroom fell deathly silent. Baldwin's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the witness box. I don't know. Maybe I touched it when I was fixing. Convenient, Mr. Grayson said dryly. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit additional evidence into the record. Investigators have uncovered discrepancies in Mr. Baldwin's financial records, including a large cash withdrawal shortly before the attack. We believe this money was tied to a dispute with Mr. Richards. Baldwin's lawyer immediately jumped to his feet. Objection, this is speculation. Overruled, Judge Whitaker said. Mr. Baldwin, you will answer the question. Baldwin looked like he was about to faint. He stammered. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Mr. Grayson pressed. Because it seems to me that you had a motive, opportunity, and the means to harm Mr. Richards. Baldwin clutched the railing of the witness box, his breathing shallow. You don't understand. Help us understand, Mr. Grayson said, his voice sharp. Did you or did you not enter Mr. Richards' house the night of the attack? Baldwin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The judge leaned forward. Answer the question, Mr. Baldwin. The entire courtroom held its breath. Emily's nails dug into the soft fur of her bunny, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Finally, Baldwin muttered something under his breath. Speak up, Judge Whitaker said. I didn't mean to hurt him, Baldwin shouted suddenly, his voice cracking. The courtroom erupted and the judge banged his gavel furiously. Order, he barked. Mr. Baldwin, are you confessing to the attack on Mr. Richards? Baldwin slumped in his seat, his face buried in his hands. It was an accident, he mumbled. He owed me money and we argued. I just wanted to scare him, but things got out of hand. Emily's jaw dropped. The room buzzed with shock and disbelief. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Grayson turned to Emily and gave her a small nod, his eyes shining with gratitude. The judge called for a recess, and the courtroom emptied in a flurry of chaos. Emily stayed seated, her bunny clutched tightly in her lap. She couldn't believe it. Baldwin had confessed. Her dad was innocent, but as the room cleared, she noticed something strange. Baldwin's lawyer was speaking quietly with the prosecutor, their heads bent close together. The prosecutor nodded, his expression grim, and left the room in a hurry. Emily said, tugging on Sarah's sleeve. Why did he leave like that? Sarah frowned, following Emily's gaze. I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe it's nothing. But Emily had a sinking feeling in her stomach. Something wasn't right. Later that evening, as Sarah and Emily sat in the courthouse waiting room, Mr. Grayson approached them with a troubled expression. There's been a development, he said, sitting down beside them. What kind of development? Sarah asked, her voice wary. After Baldwin's confession, the police searched his home again, Mr. Grayson explained. They found some evidence that suggests he might not have acted alone. Emily's eyes widened. What do you mean? Mr. Grayson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. There were traces of another person's DNA on some of the items in Baldwin's house. The police believe he may have had an accomplice, Sarah gasped. Who? We don't know yet, Mr. Grayson admitted, but they're working on it. Until they figure it out, the case against your dad isn't officially closed. Emily's heart sank. She had thought the nightmare was over, but now it seemed like there was still more to uncover. As she stared out the window at the darkening sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The following morning, Emily and her mom returned to the courthouse with heavy hearts. The revelation of a potential accomplice had cast a shadow over what should have been a victory. Matt's trial was still ongoing, and his freedom hung in the balance. Emily felt the weight of her family's struggle more than ever. But she was determined to keep fighting for her dad. The courtroom was eerily quiet when the session began. Baldwin had been taken into custody, but his lawyer was still present, representing him during the legal proceedings. The judge called the court to order, and Mr. Grayson stood to address the court. "Your Honor," he began, while Mr. Baldwin's confession has shed light on certain aspects of this case. The revelation of a possible accomplice introduces new questions. I request a delay in the trial to allow the defense and law enforcement to investigate further. The prosecutor, Mr. Collins, rose immediately. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a stalling tactic. The evidence against Mr. Thompson remains strong. A confession from Mr. Baldwin doesn't negate Mr. Thompson's involvement." The judge raised a hand to silence the argument. "Mr. Collins, the defense has presented credible evidence that warrants further investigation. I will grant a recess, but this trial will resume promptly once new findings are available. Court is adjourned for the day." The gavel slammed, and the courtroom began to empty. Emily tugged on Mr. Grayson's sleeve as he packed up his notes. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small but determined. "We wait for the police to finish their investigation," Mr. Grayson said. "They're going through Baldwin's house and looking for clues that might lead to the accomplice. If they find something, it could change everything." Emily nodded, but waiting felt unbearable. She wanted to help, to do something, anything to bring her dad home. That evening, back at home, Emily sat at the kitchen table with her diary open. She flipped through her notes, trying to find anything she might have missed. Her mom was in the living room, speaking quietly on the phone with her dad, who was still being held in jail. Emily's mind drifted back to Baldwin. She thought about the way he had looked in court, scared and angry, like he was hiding something even worse than what he had already admitted. She remembered seeing him arguing with Mr. Richards, and something about that memory struck her as odd. "Why would someone like Baldwin need an accomplice?" she murmured to herself. "He's always been so stubborn. He doesn't even like asking for help." Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Sarah came into the kitchen, her face pale. "Emily, stay here," she said quickly, heading to answer the door. Emily watched as her mom opened it to reveal a police officer standing on the porch. He was holding a small evidence bag in his hand. "Mrs. Thompson," the officer said, his voice low, "I need to ask you some questions about this." He held up the bag, and Emily gasped. Inside was a silver locket, its chain broken and its surface scratched. Sarah frowned. "I've never seen that before. What does it have to do with us?" The officer hesitated. "It was found in Baldwin's house, and it has Emily's fingerprints on it." The words hit like a thunderclap. Sarah's jaw dropped, and Emily felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "That's impossible," Sarah said, shaking her head. "Emily's never been in his house." "I understand this is a shock," the officer said, "but we need to figure out how this happened. Can we speak with Emily?" Sarah nodded reluctantly, and Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding. "I don't know how my fingerprints got on that," she said. "I've never seen it before." The officer knelt down to her level. "Think hard, Emily. Did you ever touch a locket like this? Maybe someone gave it to you, or you saw it somewhere." Emily stared at the locket, her mind racing. And then, like a bolt of lightning, it hit her. She had seen the locket before, on Mr. Richards's porch. It had been lying in the dirt the day after the attack. She had picked it up, thinking it belonged to him. But when her mom called her inside, she had forgotten about it and dropped it on the ground. "I touched it once," Emily said, her voice trembling, "but it was outside Mr. Richards's house, not Baldwin's." The officer exchanged a look with Sarah. "That's important information, Emily. Thank you for telling us. We'll need to investigate further." As the officer left, Sarah hugged Emily tightly. "You did the right thing, sweetheart," she said. "But this just keeps getting more complicated." The next morning, Emily woke up to find 2 police cars parked outside her house. Sarah explained that the officers were there to take a statement from Mr. Richards, who had finally regained consciousness after weeks in the hospital. Emily felt a surge of hope. If Mr. Richards could speak, maybe he could clear everything up. But when the officers returned later that day, their expressions were grim. "Mr. Richards doesn't remember much," one of them told Sarah. "He says he heard voices, but he couldn't see who they belonged to. He also mentioned hearing the high sound of something breaking, maybe a struggle, but that's all he remembers." Emily slumped in her chair, disappointment washing over her. She had hoped Mr. Richards's testimony would be the breakthrough they needed. Instead, it seemed like they were back to square one. But then, one of the officers pulled out his notebook. "There was one other thing," he said. "Mr. Richards mentioned that one of the voices sounded familiar. He couldn't place it, but he said it was someone he'd spoken to before." Sarah frowned. "Someone from the neighborhood, possibly?" The officer nodded. "We're checking records to see if there's anyone who might fit that description." Emily's mind raced. Could it be someone they all knew? Someone who had blended in so well that no one had suspected them? As night fell, Emily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts swirled with questions and possibilities. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was a piece of the puzzle she was still missing. And as the clock ticked past midnight, a chilling thought struck her. A possibility she hadn't considered before. What if the accomplice wasn't someone from outside their family but someone closer than she could have imagined? The thought made her shiver. She clutched her bunny tightly, her mind spinning with fear and suspicion. The case wasn't over, and the truth was still hiding in the shadows. The next morning, Emily couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. As she got ready for school, she decided she needed to do something, anything, to figure out who the accomplice might be. "Mom," Emily said at breakfast, "I think we need to talk to the neighbors again. What if one of them knows something they're not telling us?" Sarah sighed, stirring her coffee. "Emily, we've already spoken to everyone we can think of. The police are handling this now. But what if they missed something?" Emily insisted. "What if there's a clue right under our noses?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "All right. After school, we can take a walk around the neighborhood and see if anyone remembers anything new." That afternoon, Emily and Sarah visited a few neighbors, but most of them had little to add. As they approached Mrs. Taylor's house, Emily felt a flicker of hope. Mrs. Taylor was always observant. Maybe she had noticed something important. "Hi, Mrs. Taylor," Emily said when the older woman answered the door. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course, dear," Mrs. Taylor said, stepping outside. "What's on your mind?" Emily hesitated, then asked, "Do you remember seeing anything unusual around the time Mr. Richards got hurt? Anyone coming or going that didn't belong?" Mrs. Taylor's brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, I did see someone I didn't recognize a few days before the attack. He was talking to Mr. Baldwin near the park." Emily's heart raced. "What did he look like?" Mrs. Taylor thought for a moment. "He was tall with a scar on his cheek. Looked rough, like he didn't belong in our neighborhood." Emily exchanged a glance with her mom. It sounded like the man from her memory, the one she now believed to be Robert Langley. "Thank you, Mrs. Taylor," Sarah said, her voice steady. "That's very helpful." As they walked back home, Emily's mind raced. If Langley had been seen with Baldwin, it confirmed her suspicions that they were working together. But why? And what were they planning? That evening, Sarah called Detective Harris to share what they had learned. Harris listened carefully, then said, "That lines up with what we've been piecing together. We've been tracking Langley's movements, but he's been careful. If we can find solid proof linking him to Baldwin, we'll have a stronger case." Emily listened quietly, her heart pounding. She had a feeling they were getting closer to the truth, but she also knew that the closer they got, the more dangerous things might become. The next morning, Emily was woken by the sound of her mom's phone ringing. She heard Sarah answer, her voice groggy but quickly turning sharp and alert. "What? Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with each word. We'll be right there. Emily sat up in bed as Sarah burst into her room, her face pale. Emily, get dressed, Sarah said. Urgently. We need to go to the police station. What happened? Emily asked, fear creeping into her voice. They found something, Sarah said. Something big. At the police station, Detective Harris ushered them into a small room. On the table was a plastic evidence bag containing a small, rusted key. This was found in Baldwin's house during a follow-up search, Harris said. It fits a safety deposit box at a bank downtown. What's in the box? Sarah asked. We're not sure yet, Harris said. But we're about to find out. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Whatever was in that box might finally hold the answers they were searching for. Detective Harris led Sarah and Emily to the bank, accompanied by a small team of officers. The tension in the car was palpable, each moment dragging as they neared the possibility of uncovering another piece of the mystery. When they arrived, the bank manager escorted them to the vault. Inside, the officers used the rusted key to open the safety deposit box. Everyone held their breath as Harris carefully lifted the lid. Inside were several documents, a small black notebook, and a USB drive. Harris examined the contents briefly, before placing them in evidence bags. We'll need to analyze these thoroughly, he said, his expression serious. But this could be the breakthrough we need. Emily peered at the notebook through the clear evidence bag. What do you think it is? She asked. Harris held it up. It looks like some kind of ledger or journal. If it's Baldwin's, it could contain details about his crimes, or his connections. Back at the police station, the team reviewed the contents of the deposit box. The notebook turned out to be a detailed record of Baldwin's dealings with Langley and others, including financial transactions, meeting dates, and coded messages. But what caught everyone's attention was a handwritten list tucked into the back of the book. The list contained names and addresses, several of which were already familiar to the investigation. At the bottom of the list, however, was a name no one expected. Cameron Tate. Cameron Tate, Harris muttered, tapping the name with his pen. We knew Baldwin and Langley worked together, but this confirms that Tate was directly involved. If we can find him, we might uncover the full extent of this operation. Emily leaned forward. Does that mean Tate is still out there? Possibly, Harris said. But with this evidence, we can issue an official warrant and track him down. In the days that followed, the police launched a full-scale search for Cameron Tate. The USB drive from the deposit box provided additional details, including encrypted messages that investigators believed were communications between Tate, Baldwin, and Langley. Meanwhile, Emily struggled to focus on her schoolwork, her mind constantly drifting back to the case. She couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. One evening, as Emily sat in her room, she overheard her mom talking on the phone with Detective Harris. She crept to the top of the stairs, listening intently. We've traced him to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, Harris was saying. It looks like he's been using it as a hideout. We're moving in tonight. Emily's heart raced. Cameron Tate had been found. This could be the moment that finally brought the whole ordeal to an end. The raid on the warehouse was swift and decisive. Officers surrounded the building, their movements silent and calculated. Inside, they found Cameron Tate, who surrendered without a fight. He appeared disheveled and nervous, his hands shaking, as he was handcuffed. Among the items seized during the raid was a laptop containing detailed plans for the crimes Baldwin and Langley had orchestrated. The evidence was damning, further solidifying the case against the trio, but it was Tate's confession during interrogation that revealed the most chilling detail. It wasn't just about the money, Tate admitted, his voice trembling. Baldwin wanted power. He had plans to expand his operations, bigger schemes, more people involved. He said he couldn't trust Richards to stay quiet, so he had to be dealt with. Langley and I were just pawns in his game. Harris leaned forward. And the Thompsons, why target them? Tate hesitated. Baldwin wanted a scapegoat. He said Matt Thompson was the perfect target, close enough to Richards to be suspicious, but clean enough to make the setup believable. He said no one would question it once the evidence was planted. Emily's stomach churned as she listened to Harris recount Tate's confession later that evening. Baldwin's actions were more calculated and cruel than she had imagined. With Tate's confession and the mountain of evidence from the safety deposit box, the case against Baldwin and Langley was airtight. Matt's name was fully cleared, and the charges against him were officially dropped. As the family celebrated their newfound freedom, Emily couldn't help but reflect on everything they had endured. The truth had come to light, but it had come at a cost, one that had forever changed their lives. Months later, as the Thompsons worked to grow their Brave Voices Foundation, they received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a framed newspaper clipping with the headline, "Families. Courage brings down criminal ring." Attached was a note that read, "Your bravery inspired us all. Keep fighting for what's right. A friend." Emily smiled as she read the note, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had shown her the power of courage, determination, and hope. And she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, her family would face them together. The story of Emily and her family is a testament to the power of courage, determination, and unwavering love. In the face of overwhelming odds, Emily's voice became a beacon of truth, proving that even the smallest voices can ignite monumental change. Her bravery not only cleared her father's name, but also unveiled a deeper web of deceit, bringing justice to light. This journey reminds us that standing up for what is right, even when the path is uncertain, can lead to incredible outcomes. It challenges us to listen to the quiet truths, to believe in the strength of family, and to never underestimate the power of persistence. Let this story inspire us to be vigilant, compassionate, and fearless in pursuing justice. As Emily's family learned, the most profound victories come not just from winning battles, but from coming together stronger than ever.